Let's dial in. We're talking about defining moments tonight. What is a defining moment in your life? It doesn't have to be super serious. It can be a not serious one. That's all right too. Defining moment in your life. A moment that defines your life. A defining moment. What has been a moment in your life, whether it's something that happens to you, something that you experienced, that has defined your life, that has either changed the trajectory of it? Again, it may be like, hey, I found out that Wendy's had a Baconator, and that changed my life. Like, it doesn't have to be like super serious, like you found the cure to a disease or something, right? What is something that defines your life? Kylie? Moving, okay. Moving, like changing states type thing, or, okay. Yeah, it's a big move. Something else, something that defines your life.
Learning how to walk.
Yeah, I would say so. Was that here recently, or are you going back a ways? In the middle, I got you, all right? About a year ago. These legs, they're working. Someone else, defining moment in your life. Josiah has a defining moment in his life.
Rolling my car.
Oh! I was thinking they see me rolling, they hate him. I don't know, like, rolling your car. Did you do that here? Oh, okay, yeah, I was here. Yeah, it was inverted. But we're going to have to cut that out of the recording. What else has defined your life? One more. Someone that has a defining moment in their life. Yeah? Chiefs Super Bowl. Yeah, there you go. Blue Stanley. Yeah, man, they're coming like flies now. I don't know if that's a phrase, but yeah, they come out. David Freese, home run in the World Series. Anybody? 2011? I mean, it was 9 years ago, but surely you know about it. 9/11 was probably from my age. Who here is born after 2001? Every one of you guys, right? After 2000, like your birthday is 2001 or closer to now. Okay, so yeah, like 9/11 was a defining moment of my generation, but your generation, like, you are aware of it, but it's not something that, like, you know. Like, I can tell you where I was on that day, like, but we have these moments that, like, define who we are or that shape what happens in our lives, right? Coronavirus will be something that you tell your grandkids about. Like, we had to shut everything down, and no one had toilet paper, and it got rough for a while, but we made it through, right? So we have these moments, and some are big and some are small. Some are like, hey, man, I made the team, right? And that changed my year, right? There's things that, hey, I got a date to homecoming, or I got like whatever, and that was a defining moment for that moment in my life. But then we have some bigger things, right, that like define the course of our lives. Like when I got married, that changed my life to a certain extent. I watch much less sports now on TV, okay? And other things. Again, it's recording, so I love my wife. It's fantastic. It's perfect. So, but over the course of a lifetime, you have several moments that will define who you are. And if you could chart, if I say, hey, pick 5 moments that were really good things that changed the course of your life and 5 that weren't good that changed the course of life, you could probably look back and you'd be like, hey, 5th birthday party, that was awesome, right? And you may have stuff that's like, hey, I had a friend that just was an absolute jerk to me, and it changed the way I saw the rest of that school year. And I lost someone close to me, and that changed that. Like, there's a lot of those things that define what happens. And so our lives are made up of moments, and a lot of those are just a mundane, like, hey, I was driving to Schnucks. But then there's moments that are life-changing. There are moments that change the course of your life for the rest of your time on earth. And we're going to talk about one of those today. But the question we want to answer as we look at these moments is, what does it really look like to give your life to Jesus, right? What does it really look like when the gospel changes you? Because I think a lot of people go to church and a lot of people know, hey, Jesus equals good. 2 thumbs up, right? And I think that we want to do good things, we want to do the right things, but if we look at what Jesus actually says, what should be happening in our lives? And we've talked about over the last few weeks about the growth of the church and just amazing things that God did. But we're going to look tonight at a single moment in a guy's life, and a defining moment that changed the course of his life for all time. And it changed the course of the church. It changed the course of human history. And we want to know, we want to look at this story and look at what does it actually look like to be changed by the gospel? Because we can have our lives have something to do with Jesus, have something to do with the gospel, but it's not changed. And that would be one of the greatest tragedies ever. If you knew Jesus, if you knew the gospel, but it didn't change anything. So what should happen? And that's what we're going to look at tonight. So we're going to be Acts chapter 9. If you have your Bible, turn there. If you don't have a Bible and need one, let us know. We have some you can borrow or keep if you need it. But we want you to be able to follow along as well. If you have it on your phone, that's fine too. Just don't be, I don't know, taking pictures or something. Just follow along in the Bible. So Acts chapter 9, and we're going to start in verse 1. That's always the best place to start. And then we'll go from there. So what does it look like when the gospel changes you? What does it look like to give your life to Jesus? We want to start and just, there's a ground level we have to start with in the first few verses. So verse 1 says, "But Saul, still breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord, went to the high priest and asked him for letters to the synagogues at Damascus, so that if he found any belonging to the way, men or women, he might bring them bound to Jerusalem. Now as he went on his way, he approached Damascus, and suddenly a light from heaven shone around him. And falling to the ground, he heard a voice saying to him, 'Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?'" So you have this guy, and if you remember, we talked about Stephen, right? Last week we talked about Stephen, and he was a guy he was the first man that was killed for his faith. He was the first guy that gave his life because he said, "I am going to share the gospel. It is worth it. I have to do this, whether I keep my life or I don't." And he was killed. And the guy we're looking at tonight was the guy at the very end of that chapter, chapter 7 of Acts, where it says, "And Saul was standing there, and they laid their coats at his feet." And so this is a guy who is overseeing the murder of this Christian. Right? He is a religious leader who has now made it his life's goal to wipe the church off the face of the map. He wants to put him in jail, kill him, whatever he can do to stop the spread of the gospel and Jesus. And so he is the guy that was there when Stephen was murdered. He looked on with approval at what was happening. And now, right, it says he's still breathing threats and murder against the disciples. And so we're about to see one of the most life-changing things you could ever possibly see. And it is easy to look at a situation like this and say, man, this guy's life radically changed when he met Jesus. And then kind of think, oh, that was him. That's not me. Everybody's life should have a radical change when they meet Jesus, just like this guy. And you may say, hey, I've never sat and watched anyone murdered. First off, good job on that, okay? Second, you may not have done that, but you have still lived far away from what God has wanted you to do. So there should be a drastic change in your life when you meet Jesus and the gospel changes you. So the first thing that we will have to start with is there's no limit to the reach of the gospel. Think about the guy that we are talking about here. This is a guy that literally is murdering people. He has gotten permission from the government to go murder this group of people. And he's breathing threats and murder, right? This is kind of just that picture of a seething anger. Like he is ticked and he's bloodthirsty and he cannot wait to go find more of these people, put them in jail, arrest them, maybe kill them. He is an angry, angry guy that is what we would probably say is very far from God, right? But think of it in terms of like the Middle East terrorists, right? This is a guy that is doing exactly what ISIS is doing, right? And we look at those guys and think, like, I don't think anyone thinks like, oh, they may be missionaries someday. Like I don't want to go to there because I don't want to be killed by them. Right? But this is a guy that he is kind of like the head of ISIS. Okay, so have that picture in your mind. He is a guy who wants to murder and terrorize people, and it's breathing threats. That kind of like, it consumes him. He is consumed by this, but he's about to meet Jesus. And it changes everything. Right? He was the least likely convert to Christianity. Least likely person to turn and follow Jesus. He stood by while Stephen preached. And he heard the whole gospel, and he said, yep, I'll hold your coats. You guys throw rocks at this guy. Right? He had heard it before. It was nothing new to him. He has a singular focus. He's out for blood. He wants to kill people, and the gospel can stop the furthest people from God in their tracks, is what we're going to see here. I'm going to read you a quick snippet of a book. It's called Something Needs to Change. It's by David Platt. It's basically he was invited on a trip to somewhere in Southeast Asia to hike through the mountains of the Himalayas, and he takes this very remote, and he goes with this guy to these churches, and well, not even like churches, to a house, and like one or two people here and there. Like, it's no church. Like, he just goes to the few believers. There's millions and millions of people, and there's less than 100 people that follow Jesus that they know of in this area. And so he goes on this trip, and let me read you just a bit of what happens in one of the villages that they stopped at. It said, sitting on the other side of the circle is another couple. These are some Asian names from Southeast Asia that I do not pronounce normally, so I'm going to do my best. Sijun and Jin are not originally from these mountains, and I asked them how long they have lived here. About 10 years, Sijun says. Jin and I moved here from another country. We wanted to share the gospel and set up work to help amid poverty and disease. When we arrived in this country, we decided we didn't want to stay in the city. We wanted to move into the mountains to be as close as possible to people who were in need. So we built a home up here, attached to a place where we could do ministry to people's needs. And one day I met Ram. And soon after, we met Rasila. So you've lived here ever since then, I asked? Not exactly, Sijun answers. Jin chimes in. One night we heard noises at the door of our house, and we could tell something was wrong. As we walked toward the door, we looked outside through the window and saw men holding guns and torches. All of a sudden, the men started breaking the windows, and I screamed, I've never been so afraid. They yelled for us to leave, Sijun said. And as we ran out the door, they set our house and the attached building on fire. Then they pointed their guns at us and shouted, don't ever come back. You are not welcome in this village, and if you ever try to come back, we will kill you. I was so sad, Jin shares. We really believed God had called us to work in that village, but we knew that if we stayed, we not only would be in danger ourselves, but would also put people like Ram and Rasila in danger. So the next morning, I prayed specifically for the men who had done this to our house, and then we left this village, moving on to another place. When that house and ministry building burned, I thought our work here had gone up in flames as well. So how are you back here now, I ask. Over the coming years, Sijun answers, we stayed in touch with Ram and Rasila and a few other people who had followed Jesus and started a church here. They started sharing with us how more people were coming to faith in Jesus and how he was changing others' lives and families in the village in powerful ways. Then one day, Jin says, we heard about a natural disaster in this village that had destroyed over 100 homes. Ram and Rasila said they needed help, so we came. We mobilized volunteers and supplies, and by God's grace, we were able to help rebuild over 100 homes. Is that when you built the place we're sitting in now for the church to meet, I ask? That's a good question, Sijun replies, but you'll have to ask him about that one. Sijun points back across a circle at a man we learn is named Vishal. Vishal looks older, rougher, and tougher than anyone else in the room, yet an innocent smile spreads across his face. That smile soon goes away, though, as he tells his story. I used to be a tribal militant, Vishal shares. My job was to protect the villages around here from outside forces. That included protecting against Christians. Knowing what I now know about the severe hostility against believers, I think this man must have some story. I used to think Christians were spies who wanted to come into our village and ruin our culture, Vishal continues. So years ago, when some Christians were discovered, my commander told me to take my men and make it clear they needed to leave immediately or else they'd be killed. So one night I gathered my men, we took our guns and some torches, and we went to their house. My eyes shoot towards Sijun and Jin, and I look back at Vishal. You were the one banging on their front door that night, I ask. Vishal nods his head. I put a gun in Sijun's face and told him to never come back. Then I burned down his house and the building next to it. As I'm listening, I remember what Jin shared, that the next morning before they left, she and Sijun had prayed for the men who threatened their lives and burned their home. For years, I kept other Christians out, and I tried to keep Ram and Rasila and others as contained and quiet as possible, Vishal says. But then the natural disaster hit, and within a matter of days, those Christians I had threatened were here wanting to help rebuild our homes. I didn't know what to think, but I didn't want to refuse their help. Over the next couple of months, they brought food and supplies to us, and together we rebuilt all the homes that had been destroyed. Smiles now spread across the circle as Vishal shares. That's when the real miracle happened, and I became a follower of Jesus. And as soon as I did, I offered my land to house this building for the church to meet in. Vishal looks at me and says, it has not been easy. The other militants, including my commander, labeled me as a traitor, and I lost a lot of land. But it has been worth it. My life, my family, and this village have been transformed by God's love through these two couples in this room. He looks at Sijun and Jin across from him, and then at Ram and Rasila next to him. I'm speechless, and I remain that way as Ram and Rasila share more about how they've not only planted a church here in this village, but also sent missionaries to plant churches in other villages. They're now part of our network of churches in this region, sharing the gospel and planting new churches, even among people of different languages. The work of Sijun and Jin didn't go up in flames after all. And so that's obviously a long story, but about a guy who was the furthest possible guy you would think would come to Jesus. In fact, he was looking to kill these people. And this is from like years ago, like 2014, 2015. This is not like, hey, this is like back in the Bible. It's the same sort of scene that we're looking at here. A guy who wants to murder Christians, but he meets Jesus, and it changes everything. Right? Verse 5, Acts 9, it says, and he said, who are you, Lord? So this is Saul. He hears this voice. He falls to the ground, and the voice of God says, why are you persecuting me? And Saul says, who are you, Lord? And he said, I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting. Right? The gospel causes him to ask the important questions, right? Think about what happens here. He is going on his way. He is literally on his way to murder more Christians. He's on this road, a desert road, middle of nowhere, heading to this city, and then out of nowhere, this light shines, knocks him to the ground. He has this group of guys that are going with him to kill these people, and they hear it too, and they don't know what in the world is going on, but he falls to the ground, and he hears this voice. And it just asks, why are you persecuting me? Which is a good reminder for us that, hey, persecution is not of people, it is against God. So whatever someone may do to you because of your faith is not an offense to you, it is an offense to God. And God identifies with his people in their pain. Right? But think of the question that he asks, and it's so, there are two questions that he's asking here. Who are you, Lord? Right? Who is God? And what do you want me to do? What does God want for my life? But think about this. This is a guy that's grown up. He has been trained. He has lived at the temple. He is as religious as you could possibly be. And the God of the universe, who he says he's followed forever, speaks to him, and he doesn't know him. He says, who are you? Right? A religious man that knows so much about religious rules and has been raised, and he's grown up in the church. It's possible to grow up in church and be religious and not know God. So be careful. Just because you come in this room does not mean that you and God are good. Your life needs to be changed by the gospel. You can be deeply committed to something, but be deeply wrong. Think of the amount of time he poured in to being a religious person. He poured his life into it. It was a defining thing of who he was. And on this road, he finds out everything I have thought has been wrong. Everything I've been working for, I've been wrong on. That, I think, is one of the hardest reasons for people to come to Jesus, because it is the point where you have to say, I've been wrong about what my life is meant for, what I was made for. I have had it wrong. And it's a humbling thing, but I think we are afraid to say, I was wrong on that. I thought my life was about these 3, 4 things, whatever it is. And in the moment that I'm confronted with the gospel, the moment I meet Jesus, I say, I was dead wrong on that. He is what matters. What he wants matters. And those are the two questions that we have to ask. Who is God? And what does he want me to do? Or if he is who he says he is, if he is the creator of all things, who made you, who made me, who gave us a purpose in our lives, but because of sin, we're separated from him, so he loved us enough to send his son to die for us, so that we could be made right with him, to have the relationship with him if we accept him. If he is who he says he is, that completely changes everything that you do with your life. And then it begs the question, right? Okay, if he's God, if he made me, if he's the one that's in control, if he's the one that calls the shots, then what does he want me to do with my life? I mean, those are life-changing questions. This is a moment that just, your life can't go on the same. It doesn't mean that, hey, I slept in a bunk bed, now I have to sleep in a normal bed. Everything has to be different. Like, no, but the direction of your entire life changes when you answer those questions. Not just, do I think God's real? Not just, do I think there is a God? Not just, man, do I not want to go to hell? But who is he? Is he who he says he is? Did he do what he said he did? And then what does he want with my life? Everything about my life has to be on the table, right? Saul is laying on the ground, cannot see, blinded by this light, talking to God. And it's this picture of, hey, he knows that God knows, hey, I've killed some of your people and I'm going to kill more. And he's having this moment of everything I've thought was wrong. What do you want for my life now? Everything's on the table. Absolutely everything about who he is, everything that defines him is up for grabs. What I have done doesn't matter. What does he want from me now? And that can seem kind of like, man, this is heavy. Like, I don't know about, like, everything about who I was is on the table. It seems like a bit much. But it's also freeing as well. Because you may be thinking about, hey, these are all the things I really like about my life. These are all the things that I enjoy. Like, I enjoy being part of this friend group. I enjoy being part of this thing. I enjoy that I'm good at this. I enjoy my family. I enjoy whatever it is. There's things about your life that you like. But there's also stuff about your life that you're like, man, I'm glad no one knows about that. I am glad that is something that I can push down to the deepest, darkest parts of me, that it never sees the light of day, because I hate that about myself. I hate that I did that. I hate that I had that thought, whatever that is. There are parts of us that we wish we could get rid of, that we wish weren't part of who we are. And when you meet Jesus, everything you were before that point doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if you were a terrorist. It doesn't matter if you were captain of the football team. It doesn't matter if you were the most brilliant person on the face of the earth. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter the horrible things you may have said to someone. It doesn't matter the relationships you've trashed and destroyed. Those things don't matter. All that matters in that moment is, who is God and what does he want with my life? And if God has control of my life, he determines the course of my life. And how I answer that first question of who is he, right? Saul asks, who are you? And if he is God, then I'd be an absolute buffoon not to give him control of my life. He made me. He knows what I'm made for. He knows what I'm best used for. So why would I not jump on board with what he wants? If God is in control of my life, he determines the course of my life. And so what happens here? This is crazy stuff, right? He's laying on the ground, blinded, cannot see. His friends are there, right? He says, I am Jesus who you are persecuting, but rise and enter the city, and you will be told what you are to do. I think of how crazy that is. Like, I'm on my way to kill Jesus' followers. I see Jesus. He blinds me. He tells me, why are you doing this? I ask who he is, and he says, hey, keep going. Just going to the city. All right? My thought would be kind of like, I'm just waiting for the lightning bolt, like to be smote or smited or whatever the correct phrasing is there. That he is going to destroy me in this moment because he knows what I'm doing. He knows what I'm going to do. But he says to keep going. And he sends him to wait for what he will do next. It's a test of Saul's obedience to God. It's a test right away of, okay, you asked who I was, and you want to know what I want for your life. I'm going to test your obedience right away. Have you been changed by this encounter with me? Right? Have you been changed by knowing who God is and knowing what he wants for your life, to the point to where what you were going to do, you're not going to do, but you're going to be obedient to what I tell you, even if it doesn't make sense? Saul's defining moment changes everything. Saul could have been like, okay, we go back to Jerusalem, go a different way. Maybe I'm going to keep going, and then I'm going to go kill the Christians anyway. That was weird that maybe I just had heat stroke or whatever. And he may try to explain it away, but he goes and he does what God tells him to do. He says, the men who were traveling with him stood speechless, which you would be too, right? If someone gets knocked off their donkey, camel, horse, whatever it is, by a light and a loud voice from heaven, you'd be like, I heard it too. Yeah. No idea what it was. right? And they're speechless. They don't even know what to say. This is the guy that is their leader, and he's been just, completely changed, hearing the voice, but seeing no one, right? They had no idea what happened. It was a moment between God and Saul, where Saul meets him, sees God for who he is. Saul rose from the ground, and although his eyes were opened, he saw nothing. So they led him by the hand and brought him into Damascus. Think how scary that is, right? He's been blinded, cannot see, and God just says, go and wait there. So you have a blind man being led by people who were going to kill people who follow Jesus, and he's just had this moment where he's listening to Jesus and doing what Jesus tells him to do. And he goes into the city, and he waits for 3 days. And I've read this story before, but the thing that popped up to me is for 3 days, he is blind and cannot see. So it means he's sitting against a wall somewhere, waiting for days. 3 days, he's sitting against the wall. He hasn't eaten, he hasn't drank. And I think it's just he's blown away by his meeting of God, that he met God. And it blows his mind, and he can't deal with it. But think of the fear he would have. Those Christians would probably be justified in trying to kill him, right? And he's blind, sitting against the wall, cannot see, cannot defend himself, cannot do anything. And God's just saying, wait here. The most amazing part of this story, though, isn't necessarily what happens with Saul on this road. The most amazing thing, I think, happens after this in verse 10. And it's a story of an old man named Ananias. And so this is a guy that lives in Damascus. He lives in this town. Saul has gone there. He has been headed there to kill people. Now he's blind and waiting for God to speak to him. And this is what God says to Ananias. And I think this is a picture of, this is what it looks like when the gospel changes you. This is what it looks like when your life is changed by the gospel. Not just hey, you go to church, you have a Bible, you put a verse of the day on Instagram or whatever that would be. That's not what defines you. It is what you do with what God tells you to do. And so verse 10 says, now there was a disciple at Damascus named Ananias. The Lord said to him in a vision, Ananias. And he said, here am I, Lord. And the Lord said to him, rise and go to the street called Straight, and at the house of Judas look for a man of Tarsus named Saul. For behold, he is praying. And he has seen in a vision a man named Ananias come in and lay his hands on him so that he might regain his sight. All right, so this is what Ananias knows. He knows Saul. All right, he knows this guy murders Christians, not a good dude. He probably even heard that he was coming. And he knows what has happened to the Christians in Jerusalem. He knows that they've spread out. Maybe he was one that did spread out, that he left because of this persecution. And now it's coming to his front door, and he knows this guy's on his way, and he's thinking, okay, maybe I need to leave here. Maybe I need to hide. I'm trying to stay alive. And then God calls him and says, hey, that guy has seen a vision of you. And you think, dang it, he knows my name, right? Maybe I could just blend in. But he knows that there's a guy named Ananias that is going to come and heal him. And if you're him, you're thinking, why would I go heal him? Why in the world would I go help this guy? It's a good thing that he's blind. Let's keep him blind. Maybe he won't kill as many Christians. If he can't see us, he can't kill us. God asked him to do a really hard thing. He asked him to do a very difficult thing that may cost him his life. Right? He has no idea. But God is asking him something that says, Ananias, I need to know if you're willing to be obedient in the difficult things that I ask you to do. Do I really have your life? Are you really following me? Ananias, right, says, but Ananias answered, Lord, I have heard from many about this man, a.k.a. I know he's a murderer, how much evil he has done to your saints at Jerusalem, right? He's killed people, not just your people, God, okay? Keep in mind, he's killed your people. This is a bad dude. And here, he has authority from the chief priest to bind all who call on your name. This is why it doesn't make sense. This is really, really hard thing that you're asking me to do. It's kind of Jesus, are you sure this is what you want from me? Verse 15, but the Lord said to him, go, for he is a chosen instrument of mine to carry my name before the Gentiles and kings and the children of Israel. What? Right? If I'm the guy being told to go do this, I'm thinking like, okay, are we talking about the same guy? I'm talking about terrorist, murderer, bad dude. You're talking about chosen instrument to take the gospel to the Gentiles and other people. Like, not the same guy. But the gospel changes everything. Meeting Jesus changes everything. And what you do is what Ananias does. You embrace the hard things that he calls you to do. Verse 16 says, for I will show him how much he must suffer for the sake of my name. And then verse 17, so Ananias departed and entered the house. He knows that Stephen was murdered. He knows other Christians have been murdered. He knows that Stephen was being obedient to God when he was murdered. So he knows, like, well, if I'm doing what God wants me to do, I may get killed. Right? So often we've heard the phrase, like, the safest place is in the middle of God's will. It's the right place to be, but it's never the safest place. You can look through the story of the church for years and years and years and decades and decades and decades and centuries and centuries. People that are in the middle of God's will usually suffer. In fact, he's even saying, hey, I am going to let Saul know how much he's going to suffer for my name. So the safest place is not in the middle of God's will, but it's the right place to be. And Ananias knows that, hey, it's not safe. God has asked me to do something not safe. It could cost me my life. But he goes anyway. So he departed and entered the house. And laying his hands on him, he said, brother Saul. Think about that. He called him brother. Right? Family, like we have a relationship. We are bound like together. This is a guy who's murdered people he knows. That's a guy who is wanting to kill him too up until this moment he met Jesus. And Ananias goes to him and he's obedient to God and he calls him brother and he embraces him. Right? And he says, the Lord Jesus, who appeared to you on the road by which you came, has sent me, so that you may regain your sight and be filled with the Holy Spirit. And immediately something like scales fell from his eyes, and he regained his sight. Then he rose and was baptized, and taking food, he was strengthened. Right? God has told him to seek out this man who wants to kill him. Ananias sees the danger. God says, go anyway. His past reputation doesn't matter. The perceived threat to you doesn't matter. He says, I'm going to do something amazing in his life. And so Ananias goes. And he's obedient to what God tells him to do. He embraces Saul as a brother, and then he disciples him. Right? Yes, he's been changed by Jesus, but he's also still murdered his friends. Think of what he had to get over in order to see him as a brother. Think of what he had to get over in order to help this man grow in his faith. Because God had a plan for him, and it didn't matter what, like Ananias thought, it didn't matter how much he thought it didn't make sense, or whatever that was. He says, God has called me to do this, and I'm going to do it. So when the gospel changes you, you embrace the hard things that he's called you to. And then we look at Saul's life again. And the last thing is that you leave your past life and embrace your new identity in Christ. So the second half of verse 19 says, for some days he was with the disciples at Damascus, and immediately he proclaimed Jesus in the synagogue, saying, he is the Son of God. Now, as a guy who's given his life to Christ, like, okay, yeah, like he's going to proclaim God. Like that makes sense. But look at what this guy was about pre-Jesus and what he's doing now. It's a complete break. It's a huge changeover. Why? Because he was a guy that grew up in the synagogue, who grew up in the church, and he followed the laws, and he did everything, and he was a leader in that, and he was the one in there saying, no, this guy Jesus is not God. We need to keep doing what we've been doing. And then he has this moment with Jesus, and he's changed by the gospel and by accepting what God did for him. And he immediately goes in the synagogue and basically says, I was completely wrong. Jesus is God. He has just severed every social, cultural tie that he had. He has walked into people who see him as a rock star because of what he's trying to do to the church. And he has now said, I was completely wrong in that. The one they follow is real. I follow him now too. Completely cut himself off from everything. He goes in the place that is the place that gave him his significance, right? What defined him, he goes into that place and he declares his faith in Jesus. And he declares, hey, I am not following what I used to follow. I am no longer one of you. I now am with Jesus. He is the Son of God. And all who heard him were amazed and said, Is not this the man who made havoc in Jerusalem and those who called upon his name? And has he not come here for this purpose to bring them bound before the chief priests? They're basically saying, this guy likes murdering people. He likes to murder people who say and identify with what he just said. Is this the same guy? Right? People should see a difference when Jesus changes you. Right? And so these are people that knew him and said, this is not the same person. There's no way. Because the guy that I know would murder this guy. Jesus causes such a huge change in your life that people should not recognize you. Right? If you've been changed by Jesus, people would say, who is that? You're totally different. One thing we have to note, though, is what he is doing is he's not going in saying suckers, I am done with you. I know Jesus, you guys are the worst. I hate you. Go die. Right? He's not saying that. Right? He is saying, I am not done with you, but I am done with who I was. And the person that you knew no longer exists because Jesus has changed me. So I'm going to look a lot different. I want you to meet him too. I want you to know him. So often I think we get this picture of okay, if I become a Christian, then I cannot hang out with the same people. No, Jesus hung out with those people. Right? Jesus showed up in your life just before you knew him. Right? He says, I'm not done with you, but I'm done with who I was. And the people that knew him were shocked because Jesus and the gospel changed everything. It should be noticeable. It should be shocking. And it is the defining moment of your life. Everything goes out the window at that moment. And Jesus makes you into who he wants you to be. But Saul increased all the more in strength and confounded the Jews who lived in Damascus by proving that Jesus was the Christ. There's so much in this story. I think a lot of times we complicate things and it's just, this is a guy that met Jesus. And it completely changed everything about who he was, how he identified himself, what he did with his life. Everything about him changed. We wonder why Christianity in America looks so lame. And I look at this and I think, is this an accurate picture of my life in following him? Or have I watered it down? And God help us if we've done that. That we shouldn't look at this and say, wow, that's an outlier. That's kind of that's a real wide example of that. But most people aren't like that. No, that's what it should be. That is what Jesus defines him. You should be totally different. People shouldn't recognize you. It should shock the world, the difference that Jesus has made in your life. And so the question would be, has he made a difference in your life? And if not, are you sure you've met him? Have you asked those tough questions of who he is and what he wants for your life? Because if he is God and he has control of your life, it should look a lot different than if you're in control of your life. And we're not talking about just the actions, but what is the desire of your heart? What do you long for in life? Is it him and his name and his glory, or is it whatever you have decided you want? We have some questions to think about that will be up on the screen. And just take a moment, close your eyes, or not if you have to read the questions, right? And think through these things. Have you been changed by the gospel? You may be here, and you've been here for years and years and years. The question is still the same. Have you been changed by the gospel? Or have you met Jesus and it's changed everything? Or you may know everything. Saul knew everything. But it wasn't until he met Jesus and wrestled with who is going to identify my life. Is it him or is it me? Have you met him? Have you been changed by the gospel? Number two, have you asked the important questions? Who is he and what does he want with my life? And what hard things is God calling you to embrace? But if you don't feel like God's calling you to something, maybe you're not listening loud enough. Because God's going to call you to some hard and difficult things. Right? Throughout the Bible, you see that with everyone that follows hard after him. He calls you to difficult, difficult things for his glory. And the last, have you left your past behind and embraced the life that Jesus has for you? We can overcomplicate things so much. But have you met him? Have you been changed by him? And would it shock people? And the beautiful part is, just like with Saul, like, that defining moment can be now. Right? That defining moment in your life, like you may say, man, I've thought I was a Christian for 3 years. Nothing's really changed about my life. And maybe you haven't met him. I'm not saying you have or haven't. You know that, and he knows that. But if you met him in a way that completely changes everything, it's where you say, who I was is gone. What you want me to be is what I am from now on. You may say, hey, I've been in church my whole life, or hey, I've been here for 2 weeks. Whatever that is. Those questions are the same for all of us. Take a moment.